All right. We are going to be reading Elijah of Buxton by Christopher Paul Curtis. It is a Newbery Honor book, and this book also has a Coretta Scott King Award. Those are both awards that are not easily gotten. And Elijah is an 11-year-old boy, and he lives in Buxton, Canada, a settlement of runaway slaves near the American border. Elijah is the first child in town to be born free, and he ought to be famous just for that, not to mention for being the best at chunking rocks and catching fish. Unfortunately, all that most people see is a fragile boy who is scared of snakes and tends to talk too much. But everything changes when a former slave steals money from Elijah's friend, who has been saving to buy his family out of captivity in the South. Now it's up to Elijah to track down the thief, and his dangerous journey just might make a hero out of him, if only he can find the courage to get back home. Okay, so we're going to start with Chapter 1, Snakes and Ma. It was Sunday after church, and all my chores were done. I was sitting on the stoop of our home trying to think of what to do. It was that time of day when the birds were getting ready to be quiet and the toady frogs were starting to get louder with that chirpity sound they make most of the night. I wondered if it would be worth it to go fishing for an hour afore it got dark. I got that question answered when Cooter came walking up the road waving at me. "Evening, Eli." "Evening, Cooter." "What are you doing, Eli?" "I was thinking about getting old Flapjack and going fishing. You want to come?" "Uh-huh. I got something that's more interesting than watching you fish. I got a mystery." This might not be so good. I ain't trying to be disrespectful about my best friend, but there are lots of things that Cooter sees as being mysterious that most folks understand real easy. I asked him anyway, "What's the mystery?" "I was cutting through Medea's truck patch and seen some tracks that I ain't never seen afore." "What kind of tracks? Were they big?" "They's long and wiggly. I followed them, but they disappeared in the grass." Cooter's pretty good at tracking, so maybe this was a mystery after all. "Let's go." We got to Cooter's home, opened the gate, and went round back to his mother's truck patch. Cooter was right. There, amongst the rows of his ma's beets and corn and green peas, were some of the strangest markings I've ever seen. I studied them real close. They were long and skinny and in 6 wiggly lines. 2 of them were a good bit thicker than the rest. They started on one side of Cooter's ma's truck patch, went clean through her vegetables, then disappeared in the grass. I got on my hands and knees to really give them the eye. Then told Cooter, "You got me. I ain't never seen such tracks nowhere. Let's ask my pa once he comes out of the field." But before we could get a chance to ask Pa, the preacher came walking down the road in front of Cooter's. He ain't tall like a common preacher that's got a church or nothing, but he tells anyone that will listen that he's the Right Reverend Deacon Dr. Zephariah Connerly III, and that he's the most educated, smartest man anywhere around. Instead of saying all those names, me and Cooter just call him the preacher. He leaned on Cooter's fence and called, "Evening, boys." I'm just going to bring this a little bit closer, you guys. He leaned on Cooter's fence and called, "Evening, boys." "Evening, sir." "Hot one today. Why aren't you two all swimming?" Cooter said, "We trying to solve us a mystery, sir." "Really? And what would that be?" I told him. "It's some kind of animal tracks we ain't never seen afore, sir." "Where are they?" The preacher opened the gate, walked into the truck patch, squatted down, and peered at the tracks just as sharp as I'd done. He took a jackknife out of his pocket and dug a little scoop of dirt out of one of the tracks. He looked at it so close that his eyes started to go crossed. I quit breathing and my blood ran cold when all of a sudden he shouted, "Lord have mercy!" The preacher quick stood up and looked all around him, the way you would if someone screamed out, "Wolf!" Me and Cooter looked too. Why? Who wouldn't have? The preacher said, like he's talking to himself, No, no, no! I knew this was going to happen. I just prayed it wouldn't be this soon. Me and Cooter called out together. What? What was going to happen? The preacher looked like his best friend just got killed. I warned them they had to check out those new free folks better, and now somebody's accidentally toted some of those horrible creatures up here. I noticed that instead of holding up his knife, the preacher kept it open. Then worst, he held on to it like he was fixing to stab something. I said, "What's somebody towed up here, sir?" "Hoop snakes," he said in a low hissing way that told you whatever kind of snake this was, you didn't want to run up on one. Cooter's eyes scanned right and left. What? What's a hoop snake, sir? Being any kind of snake was enough for me to start getting nervous. But the preacher made matters a whole lot worse when he said, "I suppose I have to tell you, but I don't want this to get any further than the three of us." He used his boot to rub most of the tracks out of the dirt. I said, "Please, sir, tell us what you mean." The preacher started talking, but never looked at me direct. He was too busy eyeing the road and the woods. Down home, there's a vile breed of snake called a hoop snake. Not only can it outrun a racehorse, it's been known to kill a fully grown bear with one bite. I looked at Cooter and hoped I weren't looking scared as him. The preacher went on. They look like near any other snake except for one thing. What? They have the habit of sticking their tails in their mouths and then biting themselves. That don't make no sense. That don't make no sense at all. If what the preacher was saying was true, these snakes sure ain't too sharp-minded. I said, "How are they going to bite you if they're clamping down on their own tails, sir?" Good question, Elijah. But they don't hold their tails when they're ready to bite. They hold them when they're ready to chase after you. Cooter said, "But..." The preacher held up his left hand. "Listen! And my young brothers, you better listen good. This may save your lives. Once they've bitten their tails, they form the shape of a circle, then stand up like a wheel or a barrel hoop, and commence rolling after whatever they've decided to kill." The hairs on the back of my neck started jumping like a skeered brushed up against them. That's another word for mosquito. The preacher said, "After they catch you and bite you," he snapped his left hand shut. He snapped his left hand shut like it was the mouth of one of those hoop snakes. "The true horror begins. You're doomed." Cooter said, "How come?" "Because, Cooter, their poison gets into your blood too quick. Within hours you commence swelling till your skin looks soft and rotten as a ripe peach left in the noonday sun." Cooter said, "What? You swells up?" The preacher said, "You swell so much that after exactly 7.5 days, the pressure in your body becomes too great and you explode like an overheated steam boiler. In seconds, your stomach and your lungs and your other entrails are flung around you for miles and miles. I couldn't believe folks who got free would do this to us, even if it was an accident." But the preacher weren't through. Worse, the swelling affects everything but your head, so you're forced to watch the whole tragedy unwinding right in front of your eyes. Cooter edged close to me and choked out, "Well, sir, at least you dies quick and ain't left to do much suffering." "No such luck, Cooter." The preacher held up 2 fingers. 2 weeks! It's 14 endless days after your explosion before you pass on. And it's no pleasant death either. You finally die from starvation. Cooter said, "Starvation? How come you don't eat nothing, sir?" "Because, Cooter, no matter how much food you swallow, it simply falls through the hole where your internal organs used to be and drops to the ground right in front of you." The preacher stared hard in the direction the tracks were headed and said, "Those tracks were fresh. Looks like Mama and Papa and a slew of babies. Which, God bless us all, means we're too late. They've already started breeding. And from the way those tracks are going, I'd say they're hungry and have to start up a hoop snake hunting party." The preacher throwed his knife into the ground where the tracks used to be and put his hand on the fancy holster and mystery pistol he always totes. "Boys," he whispered, I need you to solemnly promise me something. I want you both to swear on your mother's lives that if I'm ever bitten by one of those beasts, you'll take this pistol and put a bullet in my brain. I'd rather be shot dead than face such a horrible prolonged death. Raise your hands. I need each of you to promise that you'll blow my head right off my shoulders. I near jumped to the moon with a loud bang when a loud bang came from behind me. I looked back, and Cooter'd already run into his house and slammed and locked the door. He weren't about to promise nothing. After I showed what was happening, afore I knowed what was happening, I was through Cooter's gate and right in the middle of a good long hard run home. I had sense enough not to take no shortcuts and stuck to the road so as I could at least see the hoop snake hunting party if I ran up on it. Ma must have heard me screaming from a ways off, 'cause she was running out our front gate by the time I got there. She said, "Elijah, what on God's earth is wrong now?" I busted through the gate, pulled Ma into the house, and slammed the door behind her. I was too worried out and shook up to talk, so she started looking me up and down and spinning me around, trying to figure out what was wrong. After a second, she said, "Elijah, sweetheart, you're scaring me to death. What's wrong, baby?" Once my breathing caught up with me, I let her know about how the runaways from America had accidentally brung hoop snakes up to Buxton, and now they were out in the woods rolling around looking for something to kill. Ma looked at me like I was daft. She shook her head and said, "Elijah, Elijah, Elijah, what am I going to do about you? How many times I got to tell you, a coward die 1,000 deaths. A brave boy don't die but once." I didn't say nothing, but I couldn't help wondering how that's supposed to be comforting. Seems to me after you die the first time, the ones that follow ain't gonna really matter too much. I said, "But Ma, I ain't looking to die even one time. Especially not from no hoop snake bite. It's better to get your head blowed off." Ma knelt down next to me, grabbed both my shoulders, and looked hard into my eyes. "Elijah Freeman, you listen and you listen good. Ain't nothing in the world worth being that afeard of, son. Nothing. Nothing." Ma couldn't hardly tolerate even hearing the word toady frog. She'd near die if she ran up on one. But just like that, the conversating was over. Ma stood up, smacked the back of my head, opened the door, and said, "They is different. Them things is known to pass on warts and all other sorts of nasty diseases. And don't be back-talking me neither, Elijah Freeman. I ain't so scared of toady frogs that I'm a be running down the road in the middle of the day screaming my head off like you just done." She knelt back next to me, acting that way. "Don't look good on no child old as you, Elijah. You got to learn to get a hold of yourself, and quit being so fragile, sweetheart." Ma started acting like she couldn't decide if she was gonna be nice to me or give me a good swatting. She ran her hand along my cheek and said in a kind way, "I don't know what I'm going to do about that Zephaniah. I done axed you over and over not to have no dealings with him, Elijah. He should be shamed of hisself, scaring young folk with them nonsense stories." She was still acting friendly and peaceable when she said, "And you poor thing. You got to start thinking things through. You got to try hard to understand if what folks are telling you make any kind of sense." Then, just like that, she's back at being mad at me. She pinched my cheek hard and said, "But that ain't no excuse for you to be acting all fragile like you done. None at all. She squozed on my shoulders, 'cause being fragile's the biggest bone Ma's got to pick with me. There ain't nothing in the world she wants more than for me to quit being so doggone fragile. It's something I'm aiming to do myself, but the trouble is, me and her have two different ways of doing it. And her way always seems to be the exact backside of mine. Whilst I try not to be fragile by sucking down the looseness and sloppiness in my nose when they come, and by not screaming and running off at the littlest nonsense, Ma sets about it different. Most times she tries to encourage it by talking the subject near to death. And doggone it all, learning a lesson the way you just don't stick in your head. That way just, you guys, I'm sorry. The way that it's written in Elijah's voice. And this is, I think we figured out it's in the 1800s. And so, people in the 1800s spoke a little bit differently than, we do today in 2022. So I'm going to be stumbling over these words, I think, as the chapters go on. So be patient with me, okay? I always go back and reread it. And doggone it all, learning a lesson that way just don't stick in your head. But what's worse is Ma quits talking and starts doing something to make a lesson permanent. The first time she tried to make me quit being fragile, I didn't even know she was doing it. But that's one lesson that stuck with me so good, it seems like it happened yesterday and not a long time ago. Ma had been walking me round the yard near our truck patch, and I must have been mighty young because I had my arm stretched way over my head to hold onto her hand. I remember stopping to get a good look at a pile of dirt that was being scampered on by a bunch of bugs. I couldn't understand how things that small could be moving all by themselves. I dug my toes down into the dirt to make Ma quit walking so I could get a better look. It turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes I ever made. I can recall squinting my eyes to look up at Ma and see her pull off her sunbonnet and wipe her forehead afore she squatted down next to me and said, "'Lijah, that ain't nothing but an anthill, sweetheart." I reached out to pick one of the ants up. This was afore I learned that bugs have ways of discouraging you from touching them. But afore I could get a hold of one, Ma grabbed my hand. Elijah. Elijah. They some of God's hardest workers, and just 'cause you's bigger doesn't make it right to mess with them. Then she said, "Ooh, Elijah, look at here. Ain't that the prettiest thing?" She turned her hand loose and reached over in the grass and pulled out the most terrifying creature that ever lived. It was twisting and whipping in a way that weren't one bit normal, and it didn't have an arm nor a leg, and nowhere on it. And it didn't have an arm nor leg nowhere on it. It looked like it came straight out of your worst nightmare. But the fearfulest thing about it was that it was right in Ma's hand, which up to then had been the best place to run if there was any kind of trouble. Ma always counts that as the first time I ran off screaming, but who wouldn't have? Near everything I learnt about snakes on that day and every day since shows that screaming and running from 'em ain't one bit at all fragile. It's sensical. There's the way, so Elijah's voice is really strong, you guys, and the way that he speaks, it's like his voice is coming right out, but there's words like sensical. That's not really a word, it's sensible, but he is an 11-year-old boy, so sometimes he takes words that, is like the correct word, and he just changes it a little bit. Sometimes kids do that. I bet you guys could come up with some words that maybe you do that sound like the actual word, but it's a little bit changed. When I was a kid, I couldn't say comforter, and so instead I used to call it a comforter. See, I can't even say it the way I used to say it anymore. Comforter. So when I was a kid, it was comforter, but the real word is comforter. It weren't a week or two later that me and Cooter were down at the river, and he yelled, "Oh ho!" then snatched out a toady frog big as a pie pan. I was still smarting about the way Ma'd made me feel so fragile. So the first thing that came to mind was how fragile she'd get if she saw a toady frog as big and round as this one. Like most real good ideas, this one didn't come to us right off. One thing led to the nother, and after a while, me and Cooter came up with this plan that's got toady frogs and Ma and her sewing basket all meeting up together. Oh no, Elijah, what are you about to do? In Sabbath school, Mr. Travis is always telling us that the Lord loves laughter, and what could be funnier than watching Ma reaching down in her basket and getting a little surprise? After supper, I wrapped the toady frog in the sweater Ma had been working on and put it in her knitting basket and ran across the road to hide in the drainage ditch with Cooter. Any advice for Elijah right now, you guys? I know I'm thinking to myself, you are one brave kid, Elijah. That's very brave of you. Then, just like they always do, Ma and Pa came and sat in their rockers on the stoop, getting ready to do some relaxing. They're laughing and carrying on, and Ma put her sewing basket in her lap. She took her She took her knitting spectacles out of the basket, then quick closed it to make a point about something with Pa. She acted like she was set to reach in and pull her knitting out, but stopped at the last instance to slap at Pa's arm. She even set the basket back on the floor, and doggone it all, it seemed her and Pa weren't gonna get nothing done but talking and laughing. I was this close to losing my mind. Finally, Ma put the basket back in her lap and reached in. She knowed right off something was wrong, 'cause with that toady frog added to it, her sweater weighed about 5 pounds more than the last time she touched it. She twisted her head to the side to look at Pa, unwrapped the toady frog, and it dropped smack down in her lap. She froze up for about one second, then jumped straight out the rocker. Yarn and needles and buttons and the toady frog and the half-knit sweater flew all over the stoop like your guts do after you've been hoop snake bit. Ma's knitting spectacles jumped partway up her forehead, and she started hopping up and down and slapping her skirt like it's a fire. The whole time she didn't scream nor say a word. It was the funniest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Me and Cooter near about died peeking out of the ditch. It can't be good for you to try to keep a laugh inside. I was this close to busting clean apart. Ma heard us trying to smother our laughs down and stared across the road. She looked like she was fixing to say something, but her mouth just opened and shut over and over. Didn't no words come out, so she walked all shakety into the house. Pa called over to me and Cooter, Don't y'all move." He set Ma's rocker back up, then collected all her knitting tools and put them back in the basket. He picked up the toady frog and brung him across the road right at me and Cooter. He set the toady frog down, shook his head, and said, "Now, Elijah, you, me, and Cooter all thought that was funny. Your Ma and that there toady frog ain't likely to see the whole adventure quite the same way." Me and Cooter tried to keep our faces serious whilst Pa was talking, but tears were rolling down our cheeks. Pa said, "Past a ward or two, I don't think the toady frog's gone cause you no grieving, but your Ma," he whistled low and long. I wish I could whistle, but I can't, girls and boys, I'm sorry, so just pretend to whistle, or see if you can whistle on your end. "She's a whole nother story. So whilst you's out there rolling about in that ditch, enjoying the tormentation you caused your Ma and that toady frog, why don't you save us all some trouble and go in them woods and break off whichever switch is you wants her to beat you with?" I gotta pause here, you guys. In history, that was one way that children were punished. They would break off, it's like a swishy branch from I think like a tree, and they were essentially spanked with the switch, okay? Because you know the next time you and her is in the same room together, that's what's gonna happen. "Cooter," Pa said, "Today your lucky day, son. You's about to get 2 shows for the price of 1. If you thought that there was funny, you just wait till you see the way Elijah starts a-hopping and screaming once his Ma lays that switch on his behind." Pa smiled, then walked away. Me and Cooter had to run near a mile before we figured we were far enough away to really let our laughs rip out. And rip out they did. I ain't never laughed so hard. We fell all over ourselves and couldn't barely stand up. We rolled and rolled whilst talking about the way Ma looked when she opened that sweater. You couldn't neither one of us get a whole sentence out. I said, "Did you see the way?" Then I commenced choking. Cooter said, and then she and started pulling at the grass and slapping at the ground. Then I said, I never knowed Mom could jump so, and the laughing closed my throat right up. Once me and Cooter were all laughed out and commenced walking home, things changed. A gloom started creeping over me the same way clouds'll all of a sudden start sliding up to cover the full moon. Cooter was whistling and still laughing every once in a while, and doggone it all, I saw how unfair this whole commotion was turning out to be. He got just as much fun from everything that happened as I did, but it looked like I was going to be the one that had to do any kind of paying for the enjoying. I started working up a good apology, full up with lots of sincereness, for when I saw Ma. When I got home, Ma didn't say a word. She must have thought the whole thing was too embarrassing and couldn't see no way of buking me without bringing up the subject of toady frogs again, so she let it go. I gotta say I was real proud of Ma, 'cause the good way she took the toady frog joke. It's funny, just when you think that you can't admire your folks any more than you already do, something like that happens and lets you know you're wrong. 2 days later, I got back from helping Mr. Leroy down on Mrs. Holton's land. Ma and Pa were sitting on the stoop. Ma was back to working on that sweater and Pa was whittling away. She must have baked. The cookie jar was sitting twixt them. She said, How Mr. Leroy doing, son? He's good, ma'am. You stop in and give my regards to Mrs. Holton? Yes, ma'am. She told me to ask about you. Mrs. Brown come by. Asked if you's gonna go fishing tomorrow. Yes, ma'am, right after my stable chores. She done some baking, too. Say she hoping to trade 2 of them for a big perch. It weren't Ma that banked, it was Mrs. Brown. This made the baking in the cooking jar a lot more interesting. What'd she bake, Ma? Ma reached down and picked up the cookie jar. She said, You know how Mrs. Brown is, Elijah, always trying something new. She baked some sugar cookies and some other kind of cookies she called... Ma quit knitting and looked over her spectacles at Pa. Ooh, Spencer, I must be getting old. I can't for the life of me recall what she said they was. Can you? Pa held up his whittling, looked at her and said, Nah, darling, I can't recall either. Neither. Ma slapped the arm of her rocker. Oh, yes, now I remember. She baked them walnut and sugar cookies and something she said she gonna call rope cookies. You lucky they some left, was all I could do to keep your daddy out of them. She tipped the cookie jar toward Pa, and he reached in and pulled out a cookie that had walnuts stuck to the top of it and a sugar dusted all over it. Pa bit into the cookie and said, Almost as good as yourn, Sarah. He winked at me. Ma leaned the jar at me, but just as I was about to reach in, she pulled it back and said, Now, Elijah, you know better than that. You've been working hard with Mr. Leroy. Go wash up first, son. Yes, ma'am. I ran round to the back stoop to wash my hands, quick as I could. When I came out front, Ma tipped the cookie jar at me again, and I dug my hand right in. Ma was right. It felt like Pa ate near all of them. But as I moved my hand round the bottom of the jar, I felt one of them rope cookies. And Mrs. Brown must have just brung these cookies over, 'cause the last one left was still warm. I pulled the cookie out of the jar. My heart quit beating. My blood ran cold. And time stood still. My fingers were wrapped round the neck of the worst-looking snake in Canada West. I screamed, Snake! And before I knew it, I was tearing off across the road into the woods. By the time I worn myself out, I must have run 2 miles. I stopped and leaned against a tree, waiting for my breathing to catch up to me. Something made me look down at my hand. I screamed, Snake! For a second time. But this time I remembered to turn the snake's neck loose and throw it down. You guys, he was running with the snake. I wouldn't have thought I had enough strength in me to run, but being afeared and being tired, look like two things you can't feel at the same time. When I ran back up our stoop, Ma's and Pa's faces were wet with tears. Pa was leaning over the side of his rocker like he was having a fit. I'd been so afeard and trusted my folks so much that it didn't come to me till right then that snake hadn't crawled into the cookie jar on his own. He must have had some help. It was a true shock when I figured out Ma was setting the whole thing up as a lesson. When my voice finally came back, I said, Ma, how could you do that? They rolled. Pa fought to catch his breathing. Well, Elijah, seemed to me what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I've heard a phrase like that before, you guys. It's usually I've always heard what's good for the goose is good for the gander. But that makes sense too. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Gander is another word for goose. I've also heard a phrase, revenge is a dish best served cold. So when people want to get revenge, like Ma got revenge on Elijah, she waited a little while before she got him back. It's a horrible feeling when people who are supposed to raise you go out of their way to scare you for no good reason, and making it worse was that they were getting so much enjoying out of it. Besides, fair's fair, and scaring your ma with something as harmless as a toady frog calls for getting switched, not getting terrified. So he'd rather have the switch than the snake? Tells you something about how he feels about snakes, you guys. Why would you do that? I was crying so hard that the words were getting choked down in my throat. Ma, you're always telling me I can dish it out, but I can't take it. So if you know that, how could you do this to me? And besides that, you know how much I hate snakes. About the same amount that I hate toady frogs. But Ma, toady frogs ain't nothing. Snakes are dangerous. 'Twarn't no toady frog that gave Adam and Eve an apple. 'Twas a snake. And you ain't never heard of nothing called a hoop toady frog, have you? No, that's 'cause they're harmless. It's snakes that'll kill you. Pa was slapping his side so hard it's a wonder he didn't bust no ribs. You couldn't do nothing but expect that kind of rudeness from him, but the way Ma was carrying on, it was terrible shocking. Ma, I thought we were trying to make it so's I wouldn't be so fragile. Look at me, I can't quit shaking. I could see I was wasting my breath. If people could die from laughing too hard, I'd be an orphan. I know it probably ain't right to feel this way about your own ma and pa, but I was sore disappointed in the way they were acting. Before I got in bed that night, I even used a stick to flip my pillow over. I was so shooked up that I wanted to make sure Ma weren't gonna carry on this lesson no further. And that's it for chapter 1, you guys. I hope you enjoyed.